Okay, hi everyone, I'm Ibrahim here today with Mubos. So what we are looking into today is Introduction to CSS. So we are basically looking into how to embed in your HTML files. Like you've learned HTML before, this is about in CSS. Just a basic brush through introduction to CSS. So now let's start. So first thing, we're creating a file called index.html. So technically, without an HTML file, CSS is useless because you use CSS to style HTML, not the other way around. So now we first bring our HTML5 snippet, your sheet 1. So let's change the title to intro to CSS. Now let's test this out. Let's start our live server. Starting. Yeah, so we have this intro to CSS. Intro, not intro, intro to CSS. So here, so first thing is we have three basic methods of bringing in your CSS to your HTML files. So we are looking into the three methods today. We have the inline CSS, the internal CSS, and the external CSS. So today, let's start with the inline CSS. So first, let's begin our H1 and say hello world. Hello world. So now you can see that here we have the color of what? Black. So what is CSS? CSS is basically what is used to style a website and a page. You know, with CSS you can change the position, you can change the color, you can change the size and any other thing you want to do. So today let's start with changing the color of this H1. So basically inline CSS is used. The method of applying inline CSS is very simple. You come to your element, this is your H1. So the opening tag here is something called an attribute. You know, let's say we want to insert an image, img. This src and alt are called attributes. So there's an attribute called the style attribute. So you introduce that to your H1, the style attribute. Then you start giving it the style you want. You can say color of red. This automatically changes the color to red. So that's all about inline styling. To add more, you can just say comma. You can just continue and just say, let's say font size font. When you are dealing with inline CSS, it's one of the effective methods of styling with CSS because inline CSS has more priority than other kind of CSS, in the sense that when you're using inline CSS and you have internal CSS, the inline CSS will be more effective than the internal CSS. What I mean is, if you have internal CSS and you have inline CSS, and you style the same thing differently in both styling methods, like in inline and internal, what you have is what is in your inline CSS, not the other way around. I'll explain that in further lessons. So let's move to internal CSS. To bring in your internal CSS, you bring it inside your head of your HTML page, the head element. So you bring in your style tag. So once you bring in your style tag, there you can start styling. But it's not as easy as writing it inside your opening tag here, because you need to select what you want to style. So we are supposed to first, let's select with H1. Let's select with the element name. So we can come here and say H1. H1, you open your curly bracket and say color of what? Red. Yeah, that works. But doing this, remember, we can bring in under H1 and say hello world. This will style it red also, but we don't want to style this. We want to style this only. So all you do is very simple. You bring in an attribute called the ID or an attribute called the class. So in further lessons, you get to know what's the difference between the ID and the class. So your ID, then you say let's give this an ID of first, and the second, let's give it a class of what? Second. Let's give it a class of second. So now to style this, you change this from h1, you begin your hash, then then call your ID name, which is first. What I'm doing is that I want to style this. The ID is first. Technically, you are going to style with selecting the ID to make it specific. So you give it an hash here, then you call the ID of first. That's it. So now, what about calling a class? If you say hash second, it won't work. It won't work because of what? Because you cannot use hash to call a class. Then you say dot, use the period to call a dash. So now we have this. So that is what inline CSS. So what I was saying about inline having top priority is this. If you come here and call your style again and you say color of what? Blue, it automatically change to blue because what? Inline CSS has more priority than what? It's the highest priority. External does not have priority than inline, and internal does not have priority than what? Inline. So let's move that. I think blue is cool, so let's take it blue. So let's cut this out. Now let's move to external CSS. How do you bring in external CSS? You come create your file, your CSS file, app.css or any other name you want. Just make sure it ends with .css. So now how do you link it? There's an element we use to link to a CSS file. We call it the link element. Link with the rel of what? Style sheet and what? The hypertext reference of what? The file name app.css, because our file name is app.css. So technically we've linked it like this. Now let's style and check what's going to happen. So you can see automatically the style already took its effect immediately. We don't need this space, so we just adjust it. Yeah. So this is external CSS. So if we comment this out, it won't work because that is where the linking is coming from. So we leave it this way. So now let's try something. Now let's try something. Let's say div. Let's begin a div, a container with the class of what? Box. Div.box. Yeah, so div with the class of box. So now if we come here and we say dot box, remember it has a class, so we call it to the period box. The class name is what? Box. So let's say background color of red. It won't show because we did not give it a content inside. You know, if we give it a content, let's say G, it shows. But we don't want to give it a content like that. I want to just make it show without a content inside. So we give the width and height. Width of what? 100px, and the height of what? 100px. So that does the magic. So we can step further and say what? Border of what? 2px, solid, black. So you don't have to understand all of this for now because this is just an introduction, so you know how CSS works exactly. So now let's say border radius. Border radius is to make it have rounded edges. Border radius of what? 20px. So we have this. Sorry. Yeah, so border radius of 20px. So let's try something with this first. You can say text shadow of what? 2px, 5px and what? Black. So we have this, the text shadow. Now let's make the color red. Now we have something like this. So that's how actually how CSS works. Oh, now let me come back here. If you first styling with inline CSS style with the color of what? Red. You can see this will give it more purity and turn this to red. So you can add more style and say font size of what? Let's say 50px, and now we have it like this. So that's all about styling. That's basically the introduction to styling with CSS. So thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you stay informed when we post any video. So thank you for watching. Ibrahim here.